We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. Happy Eclipse Day, and many of you have already experienced that. Salem, Oregon, and Madras, Oregon, as well as Idaho Falls, Casper, Wyoming. Many of you that are in the Midwest right now, whether it's Lincoln, Nebraska, Kansas City, Carbondale, of course, other places on one side or the other of the totality are seeing the absolute peak. And then a little bit later, it will make its way to, of course, Nashville and Kentucky, all the way to Charleston, South Carolina. By the time the hour is over, though, it will have finished. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time, first of all, talking with our good friend Jerry Newcombe about some of his columns. And then I want to open up for your comments about the eclipse. Perhaps you've had a chance to see it. Perhaps you've heard some of the comments. Of course, there have been some people that have said maybe it has some kind of prophetic significance. I'm not one of those, but nevertheless, I want to try to give that some airing. And the eclipse so far has created quite a traffic jam. Matter of fact, some people say it may be the worst traffic jam in history. Certainly for our listeners out there in Oregon right now, that has certainly been the case. And of course, this will play its way out all the way to South Carolina. There are a number of others that are concerned that even as it is taking place right now, people might be more inclined to look at the eclipse while they're driving. First of all, that's not good, because if you don't have those special glasses, that's very dangerous. But also, they might just run into each other. So we'll see how that plays itself out as the next 2 hours unfold. But we will spend some time talking about that today. Also, the other day, I spent some time talking about how I think it really makes another very compelling case for intelligent design. So we'll get into that in just a minute. But I thought first we would talk about a few things that have been in the news. One of those is a very good column that came out by Jerry Newcombe, commenting on the tragedy in Charlottesville. He's also posted one on marriage in America. And of course, when we had Judge Roy Moore on last week, we quoted from his column as well. So we've got a lot to talk about with Dr. Jerry Newcombe, who is, of course, the co-host, columnist, and, of course, the spokesperson for Truth in Action Ministries. He's produced or co-produced more than 60 one-hour television specials. He has authored 24 different books, probably some of the best known, George Washington's Sacred Fire, as well as If Jesus Had Never Been Born, those that he co-authored with other individuals. And Jerry, always great to have you in the program with us.
Oh, thank you, Kerby. Always great to be on.
You know, in Florida, you will not see a total eclipse, but you'll see about a partial one, I think about 50%. So I appreciate you letting me stay on for a little bit. But as soon as you finish, you can go out and see, if you've got those special glasses, what's going on in Florida.
I don't have those special glasses. So,
well, we do around here. We've had some fun with those.
I was in the museum the other day, and it said, sorry, we've run out of the special glasses. So, yeah, so... You snooze, you lose. There it is.
There it is. Well, let's get into some of the issues, and then we will spend some time hearing from some of our listeners that have either had a chance to watch the eclipse or maybe have some comments about it. But one of those is
I'll wait till next year's eclipse, by the way.
Yeah. We'll
I'm
catch
just kidding.
Yeah, well, we're going to have one in Texas here in 7 years, but for some of the others, we're not going to have one for quite a while. But anyway, let's get into this, because we are seeing statues being taken down. And some of those are done with the permission of the government. Some are done as vigilantes, even just not far from where we're broadcasting, just about 200 miles down the road or so. You have in the University of Texas last night just decided to take down the statues. No discussion, no debate, no fans warning, just take them down. You've had, of course, Durham, North Carolina, vigilantes taking those down. And I think you wrote about the fact that, you know, if the one statue that everybody feels like they've got to take down is Robert E. Lee, he's kind of been a lightning rod for this violence, but you've, as a historian, have dug into a little bit more about how he would feel about some of this. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, Robert E. Lee is an ironic symbol, honestly, for racism, and that's unfortunately the way he's being construed by some circles today. And I say ironic because he did not choose. He felt that when Virginia seceded, that as a loyal son of Virginia, knowing his own relatives are right there in Virginia, he felt that he just could not plunge his own sword into his own relatives' homes and his own relatives' hearts and so forth. He just felt that he couldn't participate in that. Here's a man that didn't believe in slavery. He thought it was evil. He received slaves in marriage and then freed them at his own personal cost before the Emancipation Proclamation, by the way. So anyway, he was opposed to it, and so to me, he's an ironic symbol, and honestly, not a good symbol of racism. And by the way, in previous eras, I mean, I was just listening recently where they were talking about Harry Truman, and Harry Truman was talking about good generals America produced and bad generals America produced. And first on his list of good generals that America produced was Robert E. Lee. And, Truman was no racist. He was a Democrat president 70 years ago, 80 years ago. So, I mean, I just think it's a shame the way our history has been, misinterpreted and so forth. And one of my lines in my column about the tragedy in Charlottesville was too many statues, too little time. I mean, if you're going to start tearing down statues because there's something wrong with each particular person, my goodness, you could tear down a statue of Martin Luther King Jr. for, some of his faults. You could, why are there statues of William Sherman? I mean, that's an actual, honest, I think, legitimate question. I mean, Sherman targeted civilians in his march through Atlanta and on to Savannah and so forth. And in fact, I was just reading the other day that there may have been as many as 50,000 non-combatants killed because of Sherman and Sheridan alone, Sherman in Georgia and South Carolina, and then Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley. And some of those, a lot of those would have been ex-slaves because they would literally be starved to death because those guys targeted all food. They killed livestock so they couldn't be eaten. They targeted the crops, and they did all this. And again, maybe 50,000 people killed, and yet we have statues of Sherman, and I don't see anybody, trying to tear those down. By the way, there's one in Central Park, and I don't think it should be torn down. I think it's part of our history, and we can learn from history. But Robert E. Lee is an ironic target to me.
Well, and again, you mentioned General Sheridan in your commentary there. You also talk about the fact that when he went and fought the Indian Wars, which is another dark blot in American history, the only good Indian I ever saw was a dead Indian. So again, if you start down this road, and I believe we have, I mean, there's no doubt that we're going to start tearing down statues everywhere. You wonder where we do begin, where we end, and what is the result of maybe even 5 or 10 years from now because of the desire to remove anything that could be offensive. Because on the one hand, I understand why individuals would look at a statue and say, that person is with the Ku Klux Klan, or that person fought in the Confederacy, and that person supported slavery. But on the other hand, I can understand why, as we've talked with Judge Roy Moore and others, once you start taking down statues, all right and left, looks a little bit like a communist country or a totalitarian country. So we need to take a break, and I want to get into this a little more detail and give all of you a chance to join the conversation. We're going to get into the eclipse a little bit later, but want to continue our conversation for just a few more minutes on Charlottesville, but also one that he has written about marriage in America and the impact that is having. We certainly recognize that there are a lot of issues that we need to address related to your faith, your family, and freedom. And that's what we do here on Point of View. And Dr. Jerry Newcombe is always such a great commentator to address those issues. And a little bit later, of course, we'll spend some time talking about the eclipse and give you a comment or two on that as well. But if you'd like to join us as we talk about statues in Charlottesville, 1-800-351-1212. We'll continue our conversation with Jerry Newcombe right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The events over the last 2 weeks are reason enough to ask a tough question. Why do some people believe that there are superior races and inferior races? This certainly is not a biblical perspective. Mark Bailey is the president of Dallas Theological Seminary. He's written an insightful commentary on the absolute absurdity of a supreme race. His biblical argument looks at two key biblical passages. First is the biblical account of creation that explains that God made each and every human being in his own image. But not only does the idea of supreme race contradict a biblical revelation of creation, it contradicts the Great Commission where Jesus commanded his disciples to reach and teach all nations. So where does this idea of a superior and inferior race come from? In the past, each race and country probably thought of themselves as superior. Greeks and Romans, for example, thought that they were superior to the barbarians. But if you want to find the origin of the modern idea of inferior races, you need to look no further than Charles Darwin. The full title of his book was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle of Life. In his book, The Descent of Man, he predicted that civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. It is an interesting irony that although Darwin was an abolitionist who hated slavery, he also in his books promoted the idea of superior races and inferior races. Once again, we see the clash of worldviews. One worldview says that every person is created in the image of God, therefore has value and dignity. The other worldview says that we are an evolutionary product and that some races are more evolved than others. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Sony Pictures, All Saints, the inspiring story of Pastor Michael Spurlock with John Corbett. In theaters August 25th, rated PG, allsaintsmovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Jerry Newcombe with us today, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. The moment talking about his first column that we've posted on our website, pointofview.net, on the tragedy in Charlottesville. And Jerry, one of the things that I've said before is if I'm going to be concerned, I might even be more concerned about how they're taking our history out of the textbooks than even taking down some of these statues, because every kid reads those textbooks, and I know that's one of the reasons why you and Dr. Kennedy, when he was alive, and Peter Lilback and many others have co-authored with you to write books reminding us of our history. But at the same time, some people have said, we had E.W. Jackson on last week, and he said, well, maybe we could put some of these statues in museums. I'm not sure that would be enough, because now you have Nancy Pelosi wanting to take down the statues from Statuary Hall, and you, of course, have a couple of other people, Al Sharpton, wanting to actually take down the Jefferson Memorial. Another caller said, well, maybe we could keep the statues up and put up a placard, but it doesn't seem like any of that conversation is taking place. Instead, either individuals as vigilantes or administrations or cities are just deciding to take down these statues. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a tragedy. It reminds me, though, of, it's our version of the American Taliban and so forth. But, it's interesting when you think about it. Whenever you have a conflict, a war, as in the example of the Civil War, the conqueror always wins, and they always get to rewrite the history and so forth. So in some ways, it is ironic that some of these statues even exist. And the argument that is sometimes made that, well, some of these came during the time of the Jim Crow laws, that is is something worth thinking about. But I go back to, the example of Robert E. Lee, as a great American. Now, I think, this is going to sound crazy, but I think if the real Robert E. Lee were alive today and he were to come across somebody that was so offended by his image being up there, he'd be one of the first to say, well, tear down that statue then. Let's move on. Let's move on to a better America. But I don't think we're going to have a better America when we have this complete rewriting of the history. It's almost as if everybody that was from the North was good and pristine, and everybody from the South was evil. I remember in the Civil War series by Ken Burns, he pointed out that 1 out of 20 of the soldiers fighting for the South, only 1 out of 20 actually owned any slaves. So most of these were poor people. And in some cases, you have to admit that the war was defensive in their case because the North had invaded, because they lived in the South and the North came from the North to invade their territory. So for some people, at least, it was a defensive thing. They were not fighting over slavery. The war didn't begin directly over slavery. It certainly was the catalyst issues. No question about that. Dred Scott, a terrible, terrible Supreme Court decision. By the way, one of the statutes I believe overturned recently was that of Roger Taney, who wrote a horrible, he was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he wrote that terrible Dred Scott decision. Basically, this runaway slave or this freed slave had no rights under the Constitution. Well, that's terrible. That's wrong. And that was one of the catalysts for the actual war, the other being what happened with John Brown. John Brown tried as a professing Christian, with a Bible in one hand and a rifle in the other. He tried to cause an insurrection, if you will, get the slaves to join him and so forth. But he went there to Harper's Ferry, which was in Virginia at the time. Today it's in West Virginia. That state became its own state within that time of the Civil War. Anyway, John Brown wanted to cause this, and people didn't rise up. And ironically, it was Robert E. Lee, the federal military leader for the United States government, that actually put John Brown on trial or whatever, and then they hanged him, they executed him. And he said, this is really sad because then I had hopes that in America we could get rid of slavery, but now I see we're going to have to do it through an effusion of blood. And, there's almost a prophetic word in what he said. But again, I feel like our history is our history and we should learn from it. But I feel like in trying to rewrite the history, unless you're going to have statues of Jesus Christ and him alone, there's not going to be a perfect person that you're going to have a statue created to. And the ACLU probably would try and tear down that statue anyway.
I was going to say, that'd be the first one they'd want to take down.
So we'd end up with without all statues. I mean, come on. It's just, after a certain point, you almost end up with absurd. It's like one of the lines in my column a couple weeks ago, or last week, was, too many statues, too little time. I mean, if you go down this train, it just gets absurd.
It does. Well, let's take a few phone calls, and then I also want to get to one of your other columns, and we'll keep taking phone calls, but I don't want to keep you all day because I want to give you a chance to at least watch the news and watch the eclipse coming through Florida here in a little bit. But let's go to Georgia. Good News Network. Jan, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Kerby. I just want to comment that this revised history is saying the war was, of course, it was many issues, but they're saying the revised history that it's all about the slavery. Well, you know what? I don't understand if they go revise history to say that, why our black race, not all of them, but American blacks, are so upset over Robert E. Lee. He didn't even want slavery, and the Confederate Constitution had in the Constitution that the slaves would be freed at the end of the war. So why is it that we pretend otherwise?
Yeah, well, again, I think you're just reinforcing what we've heard Dr. Jerry Newcombe say, right?
Yeah, and again, look, let's be honest. Slavery is evil. But it is true that when the war began, Lincoln said his goal was to preserve the Union. He said, if I have to free all the slaves to do that, I'll do it. If I have to free no slaves, I'll do it. If I have to free half slaves, I'll do it. Whatever it takes, I just want to preserve the Union. I mean, he said that. It's a very famous letter that he wrote to, I believe it was a newspaper editor in New York in 1861. Bottom line is, the Civil War is a very complicated affair. You could even call it the war between the states, but it's a great tragedy. And personally, here's my perspective as a Christian, because I believe God is ultimately sovereign over history. And I think, honestly, it was God's judgment on a nation with more than 250 or so years of unrequited toil. And Abraham Lincoln said as such in his second inaugural address, and I think he's right. And I think that God used some generals that were military geniuses, like Robert E. Lee, like Stonewall Jackson, as part of his punishment for a nation gone astray. But I think it doesn't do any of us any good if we get stuck in that and we don't move beyond that. I think we need to have the vision that Martin Luther King Jr. talked about. We need to judge people not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And we have to move on in America. And I feel like what's happened is the history books have been rewritten and our godly heritage has been erased. So, you end up with this sort of Marxist version, where you have this, we're basically separated from what it is that made our nation great in the first place. And so I think this particular example is just one manifestation of that.
Just before I let you go, let me mention we've also published and posted your column on marriage, because that's another issue that we certainly have talked about, and we might come back in a future venue, and we're not dealing with the eclipse today to talk about that, but you talk about America abandons marriage at its own peril, and that's another issue that we certainly need to address. And so that's one of the reasons why I always encourage people to click on your picture there, because that will take them to some websites where they can find that. First of all, we've posted both of these columns, one on the issue of Charlottesville and the statues, one on marriage, but also there's a link to jerrynewcombe.com, and you've got some great resources there for some of our listeners in case they want to find your columns or communicate with you or in some way or another learn more about our history. And so thank you for educating us today about a part of American history that we need to know more about.
Thank you, Kerby. Always a pleasure.
We will do this again. And so, again, let me take some of your phone calls when we come back from the break. We've got a full bank of phone calls, and I knew we would. So we're going to spend some time keeping that conversation going for a little bit longer. And then we're going to get to the eclipse. By the time this hour is over, that will have gone from Oregon to South Carolina. And then I'd love to hear what has been happening in your community, if you had a chance to see it, and also get into a couple of issues, because you've had Ed Stetzer saying, Christians don't see the eclipse as a sign of an immediate apocalypse, but yet there are others that have wondered whether or not it's just one more sign of God's judgment. So I want to get into that a little bit and talk about how the press has sometimes tried to make Christians look foolish when it comes to something like the four blood moons or the solar eclipse. So there's a lot more to cover, and we will do so. But if you'd like to join us, that does open up a line, 1-800-351-1212. Your calls straight ahead right after these important messages.
From Affirm Films and Provident Films, who brought you War Room, comes All Saints. New pastor Michael Spurlock, his struggling congregation, and a group of refugees come together, trusting God as they plant seeds for a future that might just save them all.
Start a farm, you work together, you save the church.
All Saints, starring John Corbett, in theaters August 25th, rated PG, parental guidance suggested. More information is available at allsaintsmovie.com.
Point of View Radio wants to fuel change in our culture, but we need your help to do it. And I use the word need very intentionally. I worked with a well-known radio ministry for 29 years, a program that helped a lot of people. They got saved, they got elected to Congress, it produced a lot of good. But people started thinking that someone else would give, and that program isn't here anymore. Your gift today can make sure that doesn't happen to Point of View. Visit pointofview.net and click the banner Change Happens With You, or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today on the statutes and what's been taking place around the country. Started in Charlottesville. It's headed to all sorts of different campuses, including the University of Texas, where in the dead of night they took down statues rather than even talk about it or even announce that they were going to do that. In other cases, vigilantes have pulled down statues, and the push has been now to sandblast Stone Mountain to actually remove the statues from Statuary Hall in the Capitol, to maybe remove the Jefferson Memorial. We don't know where it ends, but that's one of the conversations we're going to have right now. Second hour today, we're going to spend some time talking about the eclipse. By that time, many of you, matter of fact, all of you, will have either seen it or read about it or watched it on TV or something. I want to get into a couple of issues. First of all, some have said this might be a warning. It could be. You know, we had, of course, 4 blood moons, 2 in 2014, one during Passover, one during Tabernacles. We had 2 more blood moons in 2015. Again, one in Passover, one during Tabernacles. We have now a solar eclipse, and some people have said, well, is this God's judgment? Others say, no, it has nothing to do with anything other than just a very interesting astronomical sign. So we'll get into some of those issues as well. So if you'd like to join the conversation, look like we have just about a full bank of phone calls, so let's work our way through those calls, and we'll go to Texas, KVNE. Jana, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yeah, I was just kind of piggybacking on what y'all were speaking about earlier, in that, you know, everyone is a human person, fallible, and people are messy. And if you start taking down statues of people that, you know, have done things you wouldn't agree with, there's no end to that, because you could dig into every background of anyone who has been honored in any way, having a building named after them, whatever it might be, and find something you wouldn't agree with to petition to have that removed, you know. So it doesn't seem like there's much of a basis for that to end. And in addition to that, it just seems to me there's very little introspection among people anymore. They're just jumping on these bandwagons of hate and distrust, and there just doesn't seem to be much, what am I doing in my own world to change my world, rather than, you know, let's get rid of everything that's offensive. Thanks a bunch for taking my call.
You know, even with these sports figures, too, of course, the classic one is they had a statue of Joe Paterno out front of the stadium there at Penn State, and then decided maybe they need to take that down. I go to a number of baseball fields, and over the years, especially the ones at the San Francisco Giants, I mean, I enjoyed watching Willie Mays and Willie McCovey and Juan Marichal and all those. We got statues for all of those people, and more to come. I think Gaylord Perry is the next one going up there. And then what if we find out later something about them? We got to take those down. Again, Jana, there, of course, brings us a question that I think Harold wants to bring up. That is, maybe we shouldn't be putting the statues up in the first place. So, Harold in New Hampshire, give us some perspective on that. What would you think? You need to turn your radio down. You ready to go, Harold? Yeah, go ahead. We're having a problem with his phone. So let's go on to Missouri. KCMH. Dave, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thanks for taking my call. Doesn't God say in the Bible that when people admit their mistake and try to correct it, that God remembers it no more? And didn't the white people try to correct the situation with the Liberia colony in the early 1820s, and the Recolonization Society of 1816 tried to relocate the black people back to their own inheritance in Africa, and it was the black man that refused the correction to the problem.
Well, and some of them said, well, you know, America's our home now, so we don't want to go. But let me take the broader point. The smaller one that you've talked about there is an issue that obviously we can address historically. But there is a bigger one, and that is, if indeed God does not remember our sins, sometimes we have a much longer memory. And it gets back to one of the conversations we've had here so often, and that is, it is, first of all, very difficult to give forgiveness. Sometimes it's very difficult for people to receive forgiveness. But it seems to me that if we're going to apply some biblical principles, in light of even what Janice said just a minute ago, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. The ground is level at the foot of the cross, and this is maybe something that we should be careful about before we become so critical of individuals and their actions. Now, does that mean we cannot ever make a moral judgment? No, the Scriptures encourage us time and time again to make moral judgments and to have discernment and to call evil evil and good good and all of that. But at the same time, I think you do raise a very good question about the issue of forgiveness and whether or not we are today just requiring, perfect alignment with political correctness. And anybody that strays from that at all, they aren't given a hearing. Their statue is taken down. Their particular perspective is not given a fair hearing, and on and on and on. Of course, we've seen that play out so many times. But let's go back to the phones. We have just so many phone calls. I want to give as many of you as possible a chance to join the conversation. So let's head now to North Carolina and talk to Joe. Joe, are you there? Well,
yes,
okay, there you
go. Try to be as simply short about it as possible. I guess in a sense, I'm like Isaiah, a man of unclean lips, an unlearned man. Don't have all the history or the education behind it, but it seems to me the sad thing is if you're a Christian and you proclaim to be a Christian, then I don't understand how much hypocrisy we have when the Word says, "For whom the Son sets free is free indeed." Getting back onto the chaos that we're presently having. These things are part of our history, and our children have been taught these things. They're just the history of our country, our world, and how it was built. So instead of just destroying everything, why can't they be removed into parks or areas where the people who still would like to visit can go visit, opposed to just destroying and tearing down and trying to erase our history? But then again, my mind says it comes back to what the Word says in the last day about a great falling away. And that's just the sad thing, because they'll be more ungodly and teach themselves, teach the itchy ears. They want to hear a happy, clappy message opposed to hearing the truth. And the Bible says that they're ever and always learning, but never coming to the knowledge of the truth. And that would be Jesus, because he's the way, the truth, and the life. And there is no other truth set aside of him.
Yes. You raise a good question. It's something that we talked about with E.W. Jackson last week. Okay, could we at least move some of the statutes to museums? Now, some people say, no, we can't even have them there. Well, be real careful, because I've been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. I've been to the Holocaust Museum in Israel. I've even been to the Holocaust Museum right here in Dallas. And you really say you want to get rid of museums too, or, things that you dislike? I mean, I think there is a value in teaching our history, both Western civilization as well as America. But as you point out, we could move them to parks, but most of these are in parks right now. But some people are saying I'm offended. And, of course, this is not the first time. I mean, this Friday, we will have Kelly Shackelford here, and I'm going to say, Kelly, have you noticed something? That is, years ago, we were told that a cross in the middle of the desert, which you have to drive miles and miles and miles to see, was offensive to one atheist, and so that led to a Supreme Court case that you had to fight all the way to the Supreme Court case in order to allow that cross to remain in the middle of the desert, which, of course, illustrates that a long time ago, those on the left, those who were secularists, really learned that they could say they were offended by any cross or any kind of religious symbol, and oftentimes they were successful in getting those torn down. So the others on the left, those who are maybe politically on the left, say, if we can use the same strategy that was used to tear down religious monuments, crosses, and things like that, we can use these to tear down all of these statues. And, of course, that is the other issue. So even saying by putting it in a park, certainly that would be sufficient enough to mollify and placate individuals who would be offended. And the bottom line is, no, not necessarily. Let's stay in North Carolina for just a minute on the Good News Network. Jay, I think you wanted to add to our conversation as well. What would you like to add to our discussion today?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to point out that I believe the left has a dual purpose in mind with what I'm calling statue mania. First, of course, they do wish to whitewash our history as part of their politically correct agenda. It's just one more thing of many things that they find offensive. But I believe that the left is also using this focus on tearing down statues to reset the focus from Russia mania to statue mania.
Very true.
You know, they've milked the Russian collusion allegations for all they can milk it for, and to this day we haven't seen a shred of evidence of collusion between President Trump and Russia. So now they're moving on because I believe they use these obsessions to serve to keep the focus off President Trump's agenda to make America great again, you know, by restoring our sovereignty and restoring our economy with his America First policy to fuel job creation as he's moving away from Obama's globalization initiatives, and restoring our military to strengthen national defense and to drain the swamp. And these are all things, you know, that they don't, you know, they don't want all these good things to happen for America. So I think it's just that they're going to now milk this for everything they can to keep to undermine our president and to keep the focus off his agenda to make America great again.
Well, I think that may be indeed the case. If you don't have any counter arguments or good policies, what you do is attack someone else's. Let's take a break. We've got a lot more phone calls. We'll get to those right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The topic of immunizations can be controversial to many. Some even have a religious objection to having their children immunized as a requirement to attend public schools. Those objections often fall on deaf ears, but some states have provided for a religious exemption for parents who, for religious reasons, object to their children receiving the needle. Florida falls into that category. So naturally, when Patrick Flynn informed his Florida school that he was invoking that exemption, he was surprised to hear the school refused to follow the law. So he filed a lawsuit. Now, there's an important fact that I haven't told you yet. The school is a private Catholic school. It's not a public school. As such, it is itself protected by the First Amendment to make its own policies in keeping with their faith. A unanimous state appellate court sided with the Catholic diocese, citing the doctrine of church autonomy. Siding with Flynn would, quote, further his own religious views at the expense of the diocese on the topic of immunizations, wrote the court. Quote, we are convinced that a secular court should not be making the judgment as to which side's religious view of immunization is to be respected, unquote. In other words, while Flynn has a right to the protection of his religious beliefs, he may not use the state's judicial arm to compel a private religious institution to depart from its religious beliefs. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Clips making its way from the West Coast to the East Coast, and at its height right now in Charlotte, South Carolina, or Charleston, South Carolina, excuse me. We've been talking about Charlottesville, and again, we'll come back in the second hour and spend some time talking about the eclipse, but let's take a few more phone calls because a few of you still have some comments about tearing down the statues, some of the things we've learned in Charlottesville, and just the ongoing issue of what Jay just referred to as statue mania. Let's go to Mike, KNEO in Missouri. What would you like to add to our conversation today?
Kerby, thanks for letting me talk. Just like a lot of people don't really realize that Lincoln offered the head of the Union forces to Robert E. Lee.
Sure.
And but anyway, he said he'd have to go with his state. It had nothing to do with anything else. And one of the things, I think it's politically sounds good. We try to make it sound like it was just totally slavery was the issue. It was one of them, but states' rights was one of the big things, and a lot of people don't even understand. And that's the South, was an agricultural-based economy where the North was booming with money, industrial might, and Lee. The war, the only thing I say, I think if Lee would have went the other way, the North would have had it over in 12 months. So
I wondered about that myself. There's always the what if that some of these various programs have done over the years. What if this had happened? What if this had happened? What if, of course, Lee had won at Gettysburg? And but again, that's one of those what ifs. If he had actually stayed with the North, may have even with just the sheer force of his personality convinced some of the states not to secede from the Union. But just it is our history, as we've pointed out before. Those are some things that we need to teach our children. If nothing else, we should learn from those areas of history. But let's go back to the phones, give a few more of you a chance to join our conversation. By the way, if you've hit a busy signal, we have an open line now. So this is if you've been waiting to make a comment, 1-800-351-1212. I know that sometimes when the lines fill up, it gets really frustrating because you want to express your point of view, and that's why the program is called Point of View. But let's go to Missouri. As a matter of fact, we'll stay in Missouri for the moment. Scott, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thanks, Kerby, for letting us share our points of view. It's a rare opportunity on the radio these days. My comment is sort of threefold. First of all, everybody talks about slavery. The Civil War was about money. It was purely about money. If the South could figure out a way to make money without the slaves, they'd have let them go, because then they wouldn't have to feed them. But secondly, my real point was with regard to the statues. I think I heard you all say last Friday that Al Sharpton wanted to get rid of the Jefferson Memorial.
Oh, yeah. He said that on one of the late-night shows. Yes, go ahead.
Well, the funny part about that is here we are complaining about Jefferson's misbehaviors, supposedly fathering kids with African Americans and owning slaves. And yet, at the same time, the far left uses Jefferson's separation of church and state to keep the Christians at bay. So it's cherry picking what you want out of history, which is not a lot different than what people do with the Bible when they cherry pick what they want out of the Bible.
Well said.
And I think I would echo the guy, two callers before me. I think, could it be possible that the reason why they chose this demonstration. I thought it was interesting that several days after the demonstration, Steve Bannon is gone and out of the White House, which is just another way to undermine Trump. But the funny part about that is that night on NBC News, I was just watching that newscast, and they were making a point to say that everybody that started out with Trump is now gone from his inner circle, except for Mike Pence. And I think the fellow, the two calls before, is right. This is a systematic plan by the so-called alt left or liberal left or whatever, and it truly is an undermining not only of Trump but of just the entire U.S. in general and the way of life here.
Well, again, I think one of the comments that I heard said the other day, I think it was Tucker Carlson, is that will the Trump White House be more placid with Steve Bannon gone? Yes. But will it be as effective? And the answer was no. And what he said, and it was just a throwaway line, but it was striking. He said, Steve Bannon is one of the few people in the Trump White House who actually would not feel comfortable in a Hillary Clinton White House. And I thought, if that's even true, of course, that's a big question, if it is really even true, That's powerful because it shows you how many individuals maybe still are part of those left over from the Obama administration, or even those brought in during the change of power under the Trump administration, that really aren't dedicated to, one of the things we talk about here, draining the swamp, changing the agenda, bringing about some of those kinds of changes. So, Scott, you've seemed to be right on, on target in terms of some of the things you've been saying.
Well, thanks for your time. Y'all have a good day.
Let's, if we can, see if we can get just one or two more phone calls in here. I think David in California wants to talk about what's going on there in Charlottesville, or at least the permit. So go ahead, David. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, morning or afternoon for you. I saw a video the other day that was from the morning of the rally, and as you may know, there was a big torchlight parade the night before, the Friday night.
Tiki
but
torches.
Then Saturday morning, that torchlight permit, or I don't think there was a permit for the torchlight parade the night before, that they were all yelling, what is it, blood and soil, the famous old Nazi phrase. And so that shocked people so much that the morning of the actual permit, they yanked the permit. And I don't see that on the general news, but there is a video of the police saying that the rally has been canceled, the permit's been yanked, and then that's when the alt-right people started pushing against the police, and the ensuing violence started.
Well, and again, the police at that point did not do a very good job of keeping the alt-right away from Antifa. So you had, of course, the conflict we had. I did not know that about that permit, so I appreciate you digging that out for us. Good material.
Well, this is part of that whole fake news thing that very few people are talking about it, and most people are ranting against the Antifa, but the fact of the matter is that the police line was to make sure that the Klan and Nazis and whatnot were not allowed to go to the site. It's very plain. When you see the police officer with a bullhorn saying that the permit has been canceled,
yes,
these guys stand around and shout at him for a while, and then they start to go over to the police line. And those guys, if you're familiar with military strategy, you never want to let anybody get behind the official line. So these guys just stood firm and held their ground. The police, with their shields and whatnot, just stood ground and held their shields, and did not allow these guys to break the ranks. And so then I think the opposition started yelling at them, and there got to be a few fist fights and whatnot. Those videos, I don't know if you've got a Facebook page or something. I could probably find that video and post it over there.
Okay, well, appreciate that. And nothing else. That's just a piece of information we did not have. Let's take a break. When we come back, I want to move into the eclipse. By the time we finish there, all of you will have either seen it or on television or seen it live. Love to get some of your comments. Want to talk about the impact that this has had over the years as a solar eclipse, some of the possible arguments for intelligent design, and some people see there might be some connection to God's judgment. We'll cover all that right after this.
Would you like to be above average or exceptional? I'll explain how you can be in a moment. What do you think about change? Some people love it, others not so much. I'm guessing you agree our culture needs change, but how will that happen? Change happens with you and your influence. If each of us does our part, God can change the culture through us. That's a goal at Point of View, to help you change things around you. We never charge for the information we deliver each day, but that information is not free. There is a significant cost in getting it to you. You know who helps us do that? About 1 out of every 800 listeners to Point of View. So you can be above average. You can be exceptional by visiting pointofview.net and clicking the banner Change Happens With You, or by calling 1-800-347-5151. Thank you for being exceptional by supporting Point of View. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we survived the eclipse, and I guess we also survived the apocalypse. We'll get into that in just a few minutes. One of the articles we've actually posted here is The Eclipse and the Sign of the Apocalypse, God's Judgment, and a couple of other issues that are faced there. But again, I have heard about the impact that a total solar eclipse can have, and almost all of that is played out. In Oregon, for example, when the skies got dark, all the cows went down and got ready for night. I remember when I was listening to, I think it was Idaho Falls at the time, you could hear the crickets in the background. They thought it was night, and the owls started hooting, and everybody, of course, then they get confused a few minutes later. But nevertheless, those are some of the impacts that have had. Perhaps the greatest impact is the human impact. We have some of the worst traffic jams in the history of America in some of these locales. So those of you in Oregon trying to make your way back to California, my heart goes out to you. That is not going to be easy. Some of those of you in the Midwest as well. And of course, just finishing off there in South Carolina. While we're talking about this, I mentioned this the other day, and I had people call up and go, "What?" And I'm going, again, this is pretty well documented. And that is that a total solar eclipse in some respects is the reason we have France, Italy, and Germany. You go, how did that happen? Well, it turns out that in AD 840, the 9th century, on May 5th, 840, there was a total solar eclipse that went over Europe. Now, because of this, and because they did not have the kind of scientific background we have today, this terrified individuals, in particular Emperor Louis of Bavaria. He was so terrified that he died. Well, they never worked out who would be his successor, and since he had 3 sons, essentially what they did was divide up Bavaria. So one son, Lothar, ruled over what today is Italy. Another son by the name of Louis ruled over what today is Germany. And the third son by the name of Charles was actually the ruler over France. And this all happened as a result of the Treaty of Verdun. So it's at least theoretically possible to say that a total solar eclipse actually gave us the countries of France, Italy, and Germany. Now, there have been, over these last few years, all sorts of claims about the fact that this might be judgment. And, of course, we had 4 blood moons that happened in 2014 and 2015. I'm using this to set up to a question that I'm going to get from Patricia here online in just a minute. But you might remember that there was one of these blood moons, and now a blood moon is actually a lunar eclipse. That's where the sun and the moon are on the opposite sides of the earth, and because the light from the sun passes through the earth, it kind of scatters the blue, and so mostly red light ends up on the lunar eclipse. So as a result, it creates what is oftentimes referred to as a blood moon. And so we had one blood moon on April 15th, 2014, and you had a second blood moon as well on that Passover. Then the next year you had another blood moon during Passover, April 4th, 2015, and then as well you had one final blood moon on the Feast of Tabernacles back in September. So you had 4 blood moons. A lot of people thought there was some significance to that, but then you also, of course, have some that have said maybe there is or is not significance from a biblical point of view to this total solar eclipse. We'll get to that in just a minute, but one of the callers here wanted to ask a question that I think relates very much to some of the things that happened in 2014 and 2015. So Patricia, calling in from KBJS, what's your question for us today?
I had looked at Facebook, and someone had posted something that said it was from NASA. It was a big article that in the middle of November we're going to have 2 weeks of darkness, and said the moon will look kind of blue. The temperature will be about 7 or 8 degrees higher, but they said it'll look kind of like Alaska when they go through their dark period. So I just wonder if that was true.
It is not true, but the reason I wanted to set that up is the first time that rumor showed up in the internet was in 2015, and I have to believe it might have been in some way or another tied into the blood moons of 2014 and 2015. If I remember, and again, this is a hoax, so you should not believe it, and there is nothing that NASA ever published about it. I think the original hoax said that it was going to be 15 days, or basically 2 weeks, 15 days of darkness due to the alignment, if I remember right, was Venus and Jupiter. So anyway, there's no truth to that. But again, it's one of those things that you need to check out. And so if you see that on your Facebook post or somebody sends you an email, really it's a recycled one for 2017 based upon something that came out in 2015. No truth to it at all. But I think in large part it was due to the fact that we have those 4 blood moons. And because each one of them happened during the various feast of Israel, a lot of people thought that it was very significant. So which brings me to the third article we've posted on our website today by a good friend, Ed Stetzer, in which he talked about the fact that he was seeing that some in the press were covering this in a way to try to make Christians look like they were kind of crazy. And it really caught my attention in large part because one of the headlines was Greg Laurie, who's been in studio with us 2 weeks ago, explains the prophetic significance of the solar eclipse and North Korea. Whoa. Okay, what's that about? Well, if you dig into the article, this is what Greg Laurie says. He says, for me personally, I'm not attaching any great significance to a solar eclipse. Okay, good. I'm glad he said that. He says there are many signs that Jesus told us to look for that would alert us to the fact that he is coming. His coming is near. He said the fact is those signs are all around us. Only a fool would ignore the writing on the wall. But he says as far as the solar eclipse goes, I personally don't attach any great significance to that in particular. So first of all, that's a classic illustration of what we call clickbait. You go, Greg Laurie, okay, I respect him, and he says there's prophetic significance to the solar eclipse. No, there's not. And this is a good example of what we might call journalistic malpractice. So Ed Stetzer, in the third article we've posted today, has 3 points, one for Christians, one for journalists, and a third for maybe a few Americans in particular. So we'll come back and talk about that. But then I do want to go and be fair to the fact that also our good friend, Ann Graham Lotz, who's been on the program with us a number of times as well, has a piece that she's posted called Is God's Judgment Coming on America? So I do want to kind of post those, but at the same time kind of get your thoughts about what should we do when we see some of these people making claims about some of the prophetic significance of a particular event, and how do we address that? And then a little bit later, I do want to talk a little bit more, as I've done in previous programs, about what I think is pretty good evidence that solar eclipse and many other astronomical phenomena really make a pretty good argument for the existence of God and for the evidence of design. So we'll get into that. And if you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. If you had a chance to see a solar eclipse today and maybe want to comment on that, or want to maybe call us from your phone as you are sitting in one of the worst traffic jams perhaps in the history of America in a few places, because some of those roads out of places like Madras, Oregon, I mean, there is just no way people are going to clear out of there anytime soon. We'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. We'll first read from Ed Stetzer, then Ann Graham Lotz, all that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the events over the last 2 weeks are reason enough to ask a tough question. Why do some people believe that there are superior races and inferior races? This certainly is not a biblical perspective. Mark Bailey is the president of Dallas Theological Seminary. He's written an insightful commentary on the absolute absurdity of a supreme race. His biblical argument looks at two key biblical passages. First is the biblical account of creation that explains that God made each and every human being in his own image. But not only does the idea of supreme race contradict a biblical revelation of creation, it contradicts the Great Commission where Jesus commanded his disciples to reach and teach all nations. So where does this idea of a superior and inferior race come from? In the past, each race and country probably thought of themselves as superior. Greeks and Romans, for example, thought that they were superior to the barbarians. But if you want to find the origin of the modern idea of inferior races, you need to look no further than Charles Darwin. The full title of his book was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle of Life. In his book, The Descent of Man, he predicted that civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. It is an interesting irony that although Darwin was an abolitionist who hated slavery, he also in his books promoted the idea of superior races and inferior races. Once again, we see the clash of worldviews. One worldview says that every person is created in the image of God, therefore has value and dignity. The other worldview says that we are an evolutionary product and that some races are more evolved than others. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Sony Pictures, All Saints, the inspiring story of Pastor Michael Spurlock with John Corbett. In theaters August 25th, rated PG, allsaintsmovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
I'd like to join a conversation. The moment talking about eclipses, we'll get into some other issues a little bit later, so feel free to give us a call. But let me come back to this piece that we've posted by Ed Stetzer. Appeared in Christianity Today's blog post there, and he said, contrary to the hyped-up news stories you may have seen concerning how Christians are reacting to the eclipse, there's no concern among any Christian leaders I know of that the eclipse is a sign of an immediate Armageddon and certainly isn't anything for us to fear. He says the media often attempts to find fringe people that claim to be Christian but often have little more than a platform, than a badly arranged blog and a few Twitter followers to represent Christianity to the masses via an hyperbolized segment designed to make Christians look stupid. He said, we've seen this before. The blood moons, planets aligning, 2012, other events that are adopted as signs to serve a political point or send a message of God's impending judgment. Often the message isn't directly contradictory to Scripture. Judgment is real. But the method of communicating it and proving it, that is, God's judgment is on America because of X event, becomes harmful, embarrassing, Christians every time it proves to be untrue. So here's 3 points he makes, and then I'll take some phone calls if you'd like to join us. First, for those few spreading fear about an eclipse, you're embarrassing Christians not representing Christ. He said, what I would say to those few fringe Christians who are saying such things as that you do nothing but harm the reputation of Jesus in the world around you. The media pounces and hyperbolizes their fringe perspective into being normative, and it causes reproach upon Jesus and his church. He goes on to say, your complex machinations about how the eclipse or current events are a proof that the world will end in that moment distracts people from the simple truth that they are sinners, and apart from Christ, they are lost without hope. To Christians who draw these conclusions, he says, stop. You're making yourself and us look foolish the day after the eclipse. It gives the world more opportunity to roll their eyes and assume your foolishness is our foolishness. But let's be honest, there are not many people doing that, so that brings me to my second issue. Here's point number 2. He says, to journalists who seek to highlight Christians who see the eclipse as a sign of the end, it's not honest reporting. He goes on to say it's disingenuous and dishonest. I don't see any of these news stories going around asking for Hindus and Muslims looking for their strange ideas, but they do so for Christians. He says we have fringe people who ascribe cult-like significance to normal astrological events, but they do not represent mainstream and normative Christianity. No one in the mainstream sees a sign of the eclipse in America as certainty that the world is ending on Monday. I think we've survived that. Then 3, and this will be the final point out of his article, although you can read, it goes on for a much longer period of time. Number 3 says, for anyone thinking an American-viewed eclipse is a sign of the end, how American-centric can you be? In reality, there is an eclipse somewhere on the earth at least once every 18 months. The fact that it is happening in St. Louis does not make it an eschatological sign. When a Christian thinks that an eclipse in the United States is a sign of the end, they become both America-centric and biblically unsound. Calling an eclipse a sign is like calling a full moon a sign. The eclipse is just less common. It's predictable, but it's less common. Just because something is less common doesn't automatically mean that you can adopt it as a sign to serve a specific agenda or message. So I'd love to get your comments about that. But one of the other things that we did post here is a piece by Anne Graham Lotz, and she raises the question of this: is God's judgment coming to America? And she quotes from, first of all, Joel 2, the sun will be turned to darkness before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And she said, a few years ago, I was teaching through the book of Joel when the ancient words of this prophecy came off the page. I knew with hair-raising certainty that God's severe judgment was coming to America. I've taught Joel several times since, and each time, she says, has served to confirm with deep conviction that God is warning America of impending disaster and destruction. She goes on to say that in light of Ezekiel 33, 1-6, that commands a watchman to be faithful to warn others of the danger coming against the land, I feel compelled to issue a warning once again. The warning is triggered by the total solar eclipse of August 21st, nicknamed America's eclipse. For the first time in almost 100 years, a total solar eclipse will be seen from coast to coast in our nation. People are preparing to mark this significant event with viewing parties at exclusive sites. The celebratory nature regarding the eclipse brings to mind the Babylonian king Belshazzar, who threw a drunken feast the night of the Medes and Persians crept under the city gate. While Belshazzar and his friends partied, they were oblivious to the impending danger. Belshazzar ended up dead the next day, and the Babylonian Empire was destroyed. She says Jewish rabbis have historically viewed solar eclipses as warnings from God to Gentile nations. Therefore, my perspective on the upcoming phenomenon is not celebratory. While no one can know for sure if judgment is coming to America, it does seem that God is signaling us about something. Time will tell what that something is. And then she has posted a piece by an Australian pastor. And at the end, she says, please be assured that balancing God's warning is his plea for us to return to him and rend our hearts in sincere, heartfelt repentance. I can almost hear the tears in Joel's voice as he pleads for us to repent and return to God. Who knows? He may return and have pity and leave behind a blessing. Regardless of whether or not the conjecture regarding America's eclipse is accurate, she says, we know our nation and our world is in turmoil. Without doubt, this is the time for God's people to get right with God, to repent of our own sin, to share the gospel with our neighbors, and to pray that in the midst of his coming wrath, God would remember mercy. And she quotes from Habakkuk 3:2. So we've posted both of those articles, one by Ed Stetzer, one by Anne Graham Lotz, two individuals. I have high respect for both of them that spend a fair amount of time talking about whether or not these kinds of signs could be a sign of judgment, and I'd love to get your thoughts about that as well. Just before I take a break, let me also put one more issue on the table, and then we'll have an open line in this last half hour, and that is to point out that, as we mentioned just the other day, there are many individuals that have looked, interestingly enough, at the solar eclipse and concluded that this and many other astronomical phenomenon actually argue for design. The best example that we used is from the book The Privileged Planet, which is also a video, so you can both watch the video by Illustra Media or get the book. And it is written by astronomer Guillermo Gonzalez and an individual that's been on our program many times before, Jay Richards. But Dr. Guillermo Gonzalez, an astronomer, was watching his first solar eclipse. And all of a sudden it kind of occurred to him, we've known about this for centuries, that it is a phenomenon that is pretty unique. The reason for it is that everything matches up so that we have a perfect solar eclipse, because the distance from the Earth to the moon compared to the Earth to the sun is 400 times further. At the same time, the sun is 400 times larger than the moon, so occasionally we get an opportunity where the moon comes in front of the sun and we get a complete total solar eclipse. Well, that caused Guillermo Gonzalez to say, is this just something that happens routinely in the universe or not? And looking at the solar system, he began to say, well, there are other planets that have moons. Is there a possibility that you could have a total solar eclipse somewhere else in our solar system? And the only one he could come up with was the moon Prometheus, which orbits around Saturn. But even there, it isn't a perfect circle. It's more potato-shaped, and even so, it really wouldn't be a perfect solar eclipse, and the eclipse you get would last about 1 second. So realistically, there's only one place in our solar system where a total solar eclipse can take place, and that's here on Earth. Well, that caused him to start saying, are there other factors? Because we, after all, are orbiting a perfect star. It's a right star. It's the right atmosphere. We're the right position in the solar system. If we look at the distance from the Earth to the sun, if we were even just 5% closer, we'd have two problems. Number one, we'd have a runaway greenhouse effect, but more importantly, the gravitation of the sun would lock us into orbit, and we would no longer rotate because it would just keep one side always towards the sun and one side away. That would eliminate any kind of complex life. We're even like 20% further away from the sun, outside of the solar habitable zone. There would no longer be a place for life as well. And as he and others have calculated this, the numbers are off the charts because we live in a just right universe. As one professor referred to it, it's a Goldilocks universe. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. Not too far, not too close, it's just right. And so maybe that argues for the existence of design, and design would imply a designer. Last half hour, let's take your phone calls on a variety of issues we put on the table today. We've talked about statues, we've talked about Charlottesville, we've talked about discrimination, we've talked about Robert E. Lee, we've talked about the eclipse. Let's open up the phones this last half hour for your comments. 1-800-351-1212. We'll take those calls right after these important messages.
From Affirm Films and Provident Films, who brought you War Room, comes All Saints. New pastor Michael Spurlock, his struggling congregation, and a group of refugees come together, trusting God as they plant seeds for a future that might just save them all.
Start a farm, we work together, we save the church.
All Saints, starring John Corbett. In theaters August 25th. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. More information is available at allsaintsmovie.com.
Point of View Radio wants to fuel change in our culture, but we need your help to do it. And I use the word need very intentionally. I worked with a well-known radio ministry for 29 years, a program that helped a lot of people. They got saved, they got elected to Congress. It produced a lot of good. But people started thinking that someone else would give, and that program isn't here anymore. Your gift today can make sure that doesn't happen to Point of View. Visit pointofview.net and click the banner Change Happens With You, or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head to California. Gwen, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. I think you would like to add some things to our conversation, so I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, in the Bible, and I'm so sorry that I don't know exactly where it is, but I'm thinking it's saying that when the sun is darkened, instead of it being darkened in one or certain parts of the United States, like total darkness, doesn't it mean total darkness in the whole world is the sign of Jesus is coming?
I would think so. And again, where that takes place is in Matthew 24, because Jesus talks about a great tribulation, and he predicts a time when, here's what it says, the sun is darkened and the moon is not giving its light. Well, okay, whether you look at the 4 blood moons, the sun was there, number one, and even though it was a lunar eclipse, the moon was still getting some light from the sun. So that doesn't work with the 4 blood moons. And it certainly doesn't work for our solar eclipse, because most of us are not on the path. You're in California, so maybe you had about 50% eclipse. But only those people in places like Oregon and Idaho and Wyoming and Nebraska and Missouri and Kentucky and Tennessee, Illinois, South Carolina actually had a total solar eclipse. So I think you're absolutely right on target. What Jesus is talking about in Matthew 24 is some kind of astronomical event that is going to be horrific. I believe it happens during the tribulation, because he talks about a great tribulation. So I think, I just take the words of Jesus at heart. And then, of course, you can have 2 other parallel passages. I know I'm giving you more answer than you want, but some others might want to write these down. You want to not only look at Matthew 24, but you also want in the Old Testament look at Joel 2. And we just quoted from that a minute ago, because we had a piece where Anne Graham Lotz quotes from Joel chapter 2. And then you also want to go to the end of the Bible in Revelation 14. And I think those 3 passages in one way or another come together and illustrate that whether it's the 4 blood moons in 2014 and 2015 or the total solar eclipse today are certainly something that are an illustration in a very small way of something that will happen in the future. And I don't know about you, Gwen, but I don't want to be around to see it. How about that?
I know I don't. I pray, Lord, please, I don't want to be here with this. Please take me before then.
Well, Gwen, I appreciate your phone call, but you're right on target with your questions. So thank you for bringing it up today.
So you're saying that that part is what Jesus is saying. That's what I believe anyway.
That's right. So again, Gwen, thank you for calling, and we'll get some more phone calls in just a minute. We're kind of processing the calls right now. When they come in so fast and furious, it takes Steve a minute to get them all up there. So while he's doing that, let me just come back to that. For those of you that would like to take some notes, this is important, because when we had this conversation a couple of years ago here at Point of View about the 4 blood moons, which again happened in 2014 and 2015. You had one during Passover, April 15th in 2014. Then you had a second blood moon or lunar eclipse during the Feast of Tabernacles, October 8th, 2014. Then the next year you had a third blood moon or lunar eclipse, which happened April 4th, 2015. And you had a final one taking place during the Feast of Tabernacles, September 29th, 2015. And a lot of people said, well, is there prophetic significance to it? Well, not really, but if it is a preview of coming attractions, maybe you could say that. I would not want to do what, again, Ed Stetzer warned us about, and that is trying to tie some routine astronomical phenomenon of God's judgment. But I do believe that from an evangelistic point of view, this is a great conversation starter, because people say, you have these 4 blood moons and they happen during the feast, or we just had this total solar eclipse here in America. And that would, I think, just be something that might, in a sense, give some opportunity for conversation. So take these opportunities that exist already and use them in an effective way. And as, of course, I've pointed out, probably the most effective argument of the solar eclipse is the fact that one astronomer, and he's just one of many, Guillermo Gonzalez, writing in the book The Privileged Planet, and then also you see him interviewed in the film, The Privileged Planet, talked about this really got him thinking about whether all of this was a coincidence, which is the argument our atheist friends are making. We kind of hit the cosmic lottery. We just got lucky. And so that's the reason. This is all coincidence. There's no evidence of design. Okay, if you want to believe that, I'm not going to be able to argue out of it, other than to show you that anybody that's calculated the probabilities, as we did the other day, says it's like 1 chance in 10 to the more than 200th power. That would be 1 with 200 zeros. And if you believe that that all happened by chance, I can't talk you out of it. But it certainly tells me that you want to believe something that seems almost contrary to common sense and even our own intuition. But let's take some more phone calls because we have lots of things that we can talk about with you. So let's go to Texas, KBJS. Orban, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
I sure can. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Okay, Kerby, my thoughts on this is it's not the thing that makes the news that we have to pay attention to. It's what leads from it. And, you know, when I grabbed my welding helmet, went outside to look at that solar eclipse, I just got stung to pieces by fire ants, and I got to thinking of the scripture that says, you know, go to the ant, thou sluggard, and pay attention. In the last days, we need to be ready. And what God does sometimes is he uses the things of this world to kind of lead us into other things to think about. And I think that the solar eclipse gives us a little insight into how to help other people if they think it's something like colossal. It's little things in life we need to be faithful in, just like the ants. And we can use that as a springboard to try to introduce people to Christ.
Well said. Yes, I sort of was saying that, and I stole some of your thunder. But again, great opportunities. First of all, we should always be prepared. You know, as we've had Gary Frazier on there, and he has a bumper sticker. I should put it on my car, but he's got. I think I've still got one sitting around here. Could it be today? And of course, that's always a great conversation starter. People go, "What today?" Well, the rapture could happen today. Could this be today? Could the Lord return today, or something like that? So that's one idea. And certainly the prepared, we should always be prepared. And also, if the people are fearful of whatever, terrorism, the race conflict right now that we have, the economy, whatever it might be, to help them understand that their trust needs to be in the Lord and not in their circumstances, and that's a great opportunity for evangelism. So I just see these as great evangelistic opportunities and just want to make sure that we don't get off on the deep end. And even Greg Laurie, when they, on that one article there, said, Greg Laurie explains the prophetic significance of the solar eclipse in North Korea. Well, that's just a bunch of clickbait. That was just so that you click on it to find out he really didn't say anything other than, again, this is a great evangelistic opportunity. And so, Orban, let's go forth and share the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Thank you so much, Kerby.
Well, thank you. You got some good ideas there. Let's, if I can, go to Cedric in Georgia. Cedric, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Can you hear me okay?
I sure can, and I'd love to hear your comments.
I had to ask the same question as Guy before me because I'm on the road driving, and there's no telling how long the cell signal will last. But I had a comment about the situation in regard to what had happened in Charlottesville last week and corresponding response to it, and the rising tide of opposition to Confederate statues in the South and what have you. And it was interesting for me to listen to those who claim to be connected to Christ. And Jesus made it very plain. We can read the text over and over again, but we can't continue to miss it. Jesus reminded us, he said, by this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another. So I'd like to challenge all those Christians who believe that they can continue to ignore how people, especially African Americans in America, feel about Confederate monuments and statues and symbols and still feel they're connected to Christ. Personally, as an African American in America, the symbols don't bother me, but they bother other people who I know, love, and care about.
Sure.
And because it bothers them, I believe that those who are Christians will also be bothered because there are people who are offended by them. When I look back at our history in this country, it is not a pretty picture. The good news is that many of our white brothers and sisters have worked with us to overcome the oppression that we have faced. However, I believe for the African American community, we are sometimes our biggest worst enemy.
Can I put you on hold just for a minute because we have one of those mandatory breaks, and I think you got some other points to make, but the breaks wait for no one. So, Cedric, if you hold on, I'll let you make the other point about sometimes African Americans are their own worst enemy and explain that. and then we'll take some more phone calls. All that coming up right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The topic of immunizations can be controversial to many. Some even have a religious objection to having their children immunized as a requirement to attend public schools. Those objections often fall on deaf ears, but some states have provided for a religious exemption for parents who, for religious reasons, object to their children receiving the needle. Florida falls into that category. So naturally, when Patrick Flynn informed his Florida school that he was invoking that exemption, he was surprised to hear the school refused to follow the law. So he filed a lawsuit. Now, there's an important fact that I haven't told you yet. The school is a private Catholic school. It's not a public school. As such, it is itself protected by the First Amendment to make its own policies in keeping with their faith. A unanimous state appellate court sided with the Catholic diocese, citing the doctrine of church autonomy. Siding with Flynn would, quote, further his own religious views at the expense of the diocese on the topic of immunizations, wrote the court. Quote, we are convinced that a secular court should not be making the judgment as to which side's religious view of immunization is to be respected, unquote. In other words, while Flynn has a right to the protection of his religious beliefs, he may not use the state's judicial arm to compel a private religious institution to depart from its religious beliefs. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll try to get your calls in before the end of this segment. And Cedric, I know you're traveling down the road, but I think we can still hear you. And please continue if you might.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you holding me over. I was concluding by saying sometimes African Americans, we are our own worst enemy. What I mean by that is that the scriptures are clear. God's concern and love for his children. And by the way, God doesn't have any stepchildren. He doesn't have any grandchildren. All he has are sons and daughters. And he says he's made of all nations, and I believe he meant everybody, from one blood. So we have a common parentage. They're Adam and Eve. But that being as it may, the fact that we sometimes ignore the truth of the gospel as it's found clearly in God's word, that we ignore the obvious looking for the sublime. And as a result, we lose the context of who we are in Christ. If the statues of Confederate icons never come down, it wouldn't matter. I'd like to see them come down because they say that these are people who should be elevated based on the positions that they took. That meant that they saw me as a human being, a child of God, less than how God saw me. So that alone disqualifies them to be elevated. But even if you believe they should stay, That's fine. I'm not going to be intimidated by any image or any attempt to place me in a position lower than where God placed. So when I say that, I mean, if we would simply, whether we are African American or not, whether we're black, white, green, yellow, orange, or blue, if we look at ourselves in the context of how God sees us, most of the things we are stressing and confronting about won't even matter. Because in the end, God's coming back to the earth. He's going to make all things new. And my final point is this. He says that in his kingdom, there will be nothing that will defile in all of my holy mountain. That's the day I'm looking for it. That's the hope and the consolation I have, and with everything that's going on in our land today. And I appreciate you letting me say that.
Well, Cedric, good word, and thank you so much for sharing that as you're driving down the road today. Let's, if we can, mention real quickly, he talked about this idea of, races and those kinds of things. My commentary today, which if you haven't already signed up to receive it, we love to send it to you and put it in your inbox, is where I first quote from Mark Bailey, who is president of Dallas Seminary, wrote a very good piece that came out a couple of weeks ago, actually, The Absolute Absurdity of a Supreme Race, and really makes his case, as Cedric did, that, first of all, if you look at the biblical account of creation, God made each and every human being in his own image. So we see that, first of all, in Genesis 1:26 and 27. But also then you can also see that this idea of a supreme race contradicts a biblical revelation, not only of creation, but also contradicts the Great Commission, because Jesus commanded his disciples to reach and teach all nations. So again, you can see how that is important. And so you finally, I spend some time talking about, well, where does this idea of a superior race come from? And we've had that through history, of course. There were times when the Greeks or the Romans thought that they were superior to the barbarians. But if you want to find a modern idea of inferior races, you have to look no further than Charles Darwin, because the title of his book was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of what? Favored Races in the Struggle of Life. You see it more clearly in Charles Darwin's book, The Descent of Man, which he predicted that the so-called civilized races of man, those would be the white races, I hate to tell you, but that's what he thought, would exterminate the savage races, and those would be the Aborigine and the Africans. And it's kind of an interesting irony, because he was an abolitionist. He actually was with Wedgwood and Wilberforce and others and hated the slave trade. But the idea of superior races and inferior races is found in his books, and it was taken by others to the horrible circumstances we find today. Of course, slavery already existed before that, and slavery has existed for millennia. But nevertheless, this idea of the modern concept of superior races in large part goes all the way back to some of the things that are taught in the theory of evolution. Let's go to Alaska. KJNP. Patsy, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Well, concerning the eclipse, I listened to part of the NPR's coverage of how people were reacting to it, and they said that one scientist who was an atheist, after viewing the eclipse and the wonder of it all, I emotionally became a Christian. Unfortunately, I did not get his name, but I thought that was a very interesting phenomenon, that this will turn some people to God and to salvation.
It is interesting because it turns them both ways. You've seen some of the pagan celebrations today, the idea that this is a time of heightened spirituality, which it isn't, but nevertheless, you've seen some of that, which has caused people to get more into their pagan worship of nature. And we've seen that in some of the places where that has been taking place today. And then, as you said, you see some others. And I, of course, mentioned Guillermo Gonzalez. I don't know if they meant him. I think Guillermo Gonzalez was already a Christian at that point, but maybe he's the one they're thinking about. If not, certainly the writing of Guillermo Gonzalez and Jay Richards in their book, The Privileged Planet. And, of course, there's some newer books out as well. The Firemaker, for example, by Michael Denton and others, that are all just arguing for that as we look at this planet, as we look at our solar system, as we look at even how our own bodies are made, there is just a tremendous amount of evidence of design. Now, you can conclude, as some of our atheist friends do, that what looks like design is just mere coincidence, that evidence of design just is the result of evolution. And certainly that's the argument of Richard Dawkins and others, and they're welcome to their belief. But as I've said before, the book that our good friends Norm Geisler and Frank Turek put out years ago, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, because it takes more faith to be an atheist than it does a faith to believe in design. If you want to believe in coincidence and you want to believe that Earth and the solar system and the Milky Way galaxy and the universe hit the cosmic lottery and it all happened by chance, mass, energy, chance, and time gave me everything we see around us. And if you believe that, I may not be able to talk you out of it, but I hope that you might read a few of the books that we've talked about on this program before. Here's some of the scientists we've talked about with on this program to see the tremendous amount of evidence for design. And if nothing else, the good news is the heavens really do declare the glory of God. And think about this. Psalm 19 was written at a time when we didn't have telescopes. We just looked at the stars. But even there, David and the other psalmists could look at the stars and they could say, it sure looks like design to me. Now we know so much more, because as we look at our telescopes and as we look at our microscopes, in the far dimensions of space and the small dimensions of space, we see design. And design implies a designer. So I hope this was an encouragement to you. Tomorrow we're going to talk a little bit more about some of these issues that we get into. We'll cover some of the news stories in the first hour, but Mark Clark's going to be with us in the second hour. He's written this very good book, The Problem of God, Answering a Skeptic's Challenges to Christianity. Do you have somebody in your life that just really challenges your faith and you want to know, how maybe kind of respond to some of their questions or comments? That's what we'll cover in the second hour tomorrow here on Point of View. I want to thank everybody who's been a part of this on our National Eclipse Day, Andrew and Steve, as well as Elisa. Hope that you have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow right here on Point of View.
There are those who listen to Point of View while they're driving, and some can listen at home or at work. But here's the question: where do you go where you cannot listen to Point of View? Well, if you have the app, the free Point of View radio app, the answer is just about nowhere. This is an on-the-go world, and now wherever you go, Point of View goes with you. Visit the Apple or Google Play Store and download the free Point of View app. You can listen and watch the program live or play it again later. Get Kerby's Viewpoints commentary. Click the Take Action link. Learn about important issues and make a difference in this world. You can also read articles, find a local radio station, easily contact us with your comments or questions. Don't leave home or the office or anywhere else without Point of View. Again, visit the Apple or Google Play Store today and get the app, the free Point of View radio app. Oh, and one more thing, if you like it, click that little button that says Donate Now and join the team. Point of View and the Point of View app, with you on the go.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.